Shall we start? نبتدي. We're honored to have you, Mr. Belizer, today. Paul Belizzard is an author, poet, and interview.
You got hecklers already. Salam alaikum sayyidati wa saadati. Marhaba. Afwan.
Mr. Blizzard is an author, poet, and interviewer who was for 8 years the award-winning voice of the One World Radio, where he recorded over 1,700 programs interviewing former U.S. President, Nobel Prizes, and much more, and many of the world's most powerful and popular authors. We're lucky to have you, and I believe no matter what I'm going to say, I won't be judging. Please don't judge me as you've been an expert interviewing.
I am delighted to be here and honored. Can I tell you, it is more terrifying to sit here, more frightening to sit here being interviewed by you than it was frightening to sit where you are now interviewing Bill Clinton. That was easier compared to this. I'm the frightened one.
The former letter editor of the Lady magazine, and he was appeared to be as a TV showing around the world in different TV programs. Currently, the literary director of the Firebird Poetry Prizes. So let's welcome Mr. Belizzard, and we'll keep the floor for you to give us some of the experience you went through by interviewing some most popular people, and then I think it's a trick here to can ask him also some of the
Ask me anything.
things.
If I can tell, I will.
Last night I was thinking how I'm going to interview him, because he's been interviewing all most popular people, and it's going to be very difficult for me really to ask or interview you in this. But
I'll tell you what
I'll keep the floor for you.
I'll give you a masterclass in interviewing. How about that?
Yeah, well, that would be great.
Here's the first trick of interviewing that I was taught when I did. So many of you will not know who I am, because I'm usually on stage interviewing authors to make them look great, to find out what's interesting about them. So last night I was on stage with Ben Oakley discussing his new novel, which is fantastic. And Ben is a tricky person to interview, and it makes me scared. But back in the 1990s, for those of you old enough to remember the 1990s, I published 2 books that were very, very successful. So I took some of the money and I created a radio station in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, that was all about books. It was going to be a sort of broadcasting shop window for the publishing industry of the UK, and we had to have some live programming in it, so I invented a show called Between the Lines, which was the first daily half-an-hour author interview program in British radio. It was a lot of work. I had to read 5 books a day, 5 books a week, every week for 10 years. A lot of reading. But it taught me a number of things. It was also had a trick, because we used to get the authors to read 2 little extracts from their books, so people could hear my audience, which was 7 million people a day would listen, to hear what the good books were that I'd selected, and they got to hear the authors, so you get to become friends with authors, you get to know about interviewing. And then what happened was lots of people around the world would hear the show, and they'd say, oh, the person that you interviewed the other day, would they come to our literary festival, and will you interview them? So then I got to do literary festivals like the Emirates Airline Festival of Literature in Dubai, the Hay Festival, the Gaul Festival in Port, Sri Lanka, all this sort of stuff. But of course, before you start interviewing someone, you have to find out what makes a good interview. I had to ask what makes a good interview. So I asked a man who is not known for interviewing, but is a really good broadcaster who you may have heard of, called Sir David Attenborough. You've heard of Sir David Attenborough? Well, he lives quite close to where I used to live. And I said, Sir David, can you help me? He said, there are 2 things you need to know about interviewing. And it's exactly the same things I learnt from that amazing piece of footage you may have seen when, many years ago, he was in the Virunga Mountains in Rwanda with the mountain gorillas. Do you remember this amazing piece of footage? Where suddenly he's face to face with a huge 600-pound silverback mountain gorilla. And he said, I kind of got the feeling in the middle of that this gorilla was interviewing me. So the 2 rules are, Paul, he said to me, he said, keep eye contact, show no fear. And if you can do that as an interviewer, you're fine. But the trick when you're interviewing presidents or politicians, and this is where Bill Clinton is very different. I've interviewed everyone from Clinton to Kerry, not here, but another time, Al Gore, Cameron, Emmanuel Macron, and political interviews are very different because politicians are very different people. If there are politicians here, forgive me. But most of them are not listening to the question. They are listening for the one word in the question that allows them to push the button in their brain that is the answer that they ought for what they want to say. So, for example, when you're interviewing Al Gore, he's got 27 buttons. He's got a climate change button, a defense button, an education button, a welfare button, all these buttons. But the trick with Clinton, or not that there's a trick, the great thing about interviewing Bill Clinton is that he has enormous charisma and he doesn't need buttons because he's engaging, which is why he was as successful as he was. He looks you in the eye. You know you're the only person in his world when you're talking to Clinton. And when he's listening to the question, he listens to the question, he will answer your question. He's a very smart guy.
So he didn't have buttons?
Bill Clinton, headline news, Bill Clinton has no buttons.
Okay, I mean, I think we would like, actually, with all the background you mentioned, we would like to see what was the most interesting interview you made with the, I mean, let's go, I mean, as a classification of a criteria, like, for example, as a president, as an author, so it's sort of a brief, I mean, it's very difficult. I know you could tell me sort of what of your experience and your point of view with different perspective. But having said that, if you can give us sort of a clue of these issues.
Yes, that's a good question. It's a good question. It's a difficult one to answer because, of course, the moment you say your favorite, and I've done over 15,000 interviews across radio and literary festivals and TV and radio and so on. So it's different because if you say, oh, I've had one favorite, it means the other 14,999 don't
Okay, maybe
really
let's
count.
say what's been is fascinating.
Yeah, no, but there's a way of doing that because one does have favorites. And of course, it's always an honor to interview the big names. It's always an honor to be on stage with a Bill Clinton, Charles, or whoever. Those are honors. But those interviews have a set format. You have to conduct the interview within very tight parameters. Occasionally, once the phrase is you've got the show in the bag, you've done nothing controversial for the first 40 minutes, then maybe you can ask a question which is a little more personal, which is gets beneath the public face and you get to meet the private person a little. So, of course, it was a complete honor to interview Bill, who became a friend, is a friend. It was a complete honor to interview the Dalai Lama, which very few people get to do. That was an amazing honor, a huge privilege. And of course, part of us, you know, however old we get, we have our parents over our shoulders. So although I'm a 56-year-old man, I still have my mum on my shoulder thinking, if my mum, you know, my mum would be proud of this. And I grew up in a little small village. But some of my favorite interviews, and it's a very fair question you ask, are the ones where you know you are interviewing somebody for the first time. They have just published their first book or their first poem. This is their first public outing, and there's machinery behind them. They have the publishing industry, the publicists, their editors, who have backed a lot of money and a lot of work on this person being able to deliver, not just publish a book these days, but to do all the press and the publicity and all those responsibilities. So it's a real honor to interview first-time authors, sometimes young, sometimes older. But there's one person, okay, may I tell a little story?
Yes, please do.
Have you heard, you have the International Prize for Arabic Fiction here, which I'm sure you're all aware of. It used to be called very clumsily the Arabic Booker, and happily they changed the name. But the Booker Prize is a very big prize for English language fiction, as I'm sure you know, in the UK, and it's now opened up to works from America. Well, about 17 years ago, there was a guy who had published his first novel, and he looked a mess, and he was shambolic, and his life was a mess, but he was a beautiful writer. And the publisher had called me and said, can I send you a proof? Because I think this book has something really rather special. And I read it and thought, yes, they do. And I'm not saying I had any role in him being published. He was published entirely on his own merit. But after the book was published, the publicist called me and said, he's not done press before. We're a little worried. Could you, I mean, we know you like the book. Would you please interview him? So I gave him his first ever interview. For half an hour, he read 2 extracts. And then 3 months later, his book was nominated, got into the long list, and was then shortlisted for the Booker Prize for Fiction. It then won. And the book was by DBC Pierre. And I've forgotten the name of it now, which is, do you remember DBC's Pierre?
Is it
I can't remember. Vernon Godlittle. The book was called Vernon Godlittle, and it went to sell on millions and millions of turns. And so it's a lovely interview. It's one of my favorite interviews because there's a backstory to the interview, which is the Man Booker Prize, when the moment the prize is announced at this huge gala dinner with everybody wearing black tie, ladies in fantastic dresses. In fact, that one, some of the men were in fantastic dresses because Grayson Perry was there. There's then issues. The BBC want to interview the winner, the ITV want to interview the winner, CNN, Sky News, Al Arabiya, all of them.
So you did already before with them?
No. So he's been told he's won. He gets up, he makes his speech, and then he is escorted by minders to all the great international broadcasters for his interview. And he said, hold on one second, guys. He saw me at the back, me in a suit, not allowed at the dinner, with a microphone. He said, that guy gets the first interview. The first interview I do as a Booker Prize winner is the man who taught me how to do an interview, who interviewed me when nobody knew my name. And that's probably my favorite. When you have that contract between the author, when they realize they're part of an industry, but actually it's all about people. We're all people.
I guess you're coming to a touchy point here because, you know, this الملتقى group, we've never been sort of interviewers. We're all here with a group with Asma leading it here and with all background of different proficiency, but we never been sort of more in a media. But I mean, what we learned really when we do an interview, we got to go background with the person and go do our own searches, and we try to do our best. So it's really nice to say, because there are a lot of, authors, once they come here and they start to be really feeling and appreciating the questions, answer, and the warm willing with the group that we're giving them, they really feel, they come back again and again and again, and they feel really appreciating. So it's back to the people, exactly what you said. I mean, and they also give us sort of a confidence that, yeah, okay, we're not in the media, we're not doing it, but at least we're doing something. We're trying to do what we can, you know?
Make no mistake that salons like this, and I understand that this book club has run for 20-something years. How many years? 21 years. Well, congratulations, because it's like you're throwing a stone into a pond. Those ripples that you're sending out, will endure. So that's why you're so successful. And I know a lot of authors who have come here over the last few days, and they come back, from Sarah McIntyre to Curtis Jobling, who have been raving about it, tweeting about it. So your book club here in Abu Dhabi will have international reach. So authors who perhaps might just come to visit Abu Dhabi will think, oh, there is a book club there. They might get in touch. I mean, it has ramifications. But my first degree was in medicine. I trained as a doctor. So, of course, there's an art of interviewing as a doctor. When a patient presents in surgery, you have to get to the heart of the matter. You have to get them to trust you, to talk to you, to tell them what's wrong. And often it's embarrassing for them or shameful for them. And that's basically the art of interviewing, to make someone feel that they can trust the person. I now trust you. Good doctor.
That's good, thank you.
So that's what interviewing is. That's what any form of engagement is. And the same is true of authors. Whenever you open a book, you have that first page as an author to engender trust in your reader, trust that you are not going to waste your reader's time, trust that you are going to take that reader on a journey that will fulfill.
I guess I'll ask you one last question and keep.
Sorry, am I talking too much? I'm so sorry.
No. And then keep the floor, because I'm sure everybody here want to ask a lot of questions. What is really? I know it's going to be. It's up to you if you're going to be answering or not. But what was an interview that you felt, without mentioning name, that you really went through, and then later you felt that was not a good interview?
I'm not going to mention a name.
Yeah, we don't want.
Unless it pops out. There was some, you won't know of him, you won't have read any of his books. There was a book that came out in about 2009-10 by a man, we'll call him Jeffrey, not Archer, don't think Jeffrey Archer, who is a friend of mine and a very, although I have issues with him as a man, he is a brilliant storyteller. So there's an American man called Jeffrey who is enormous. He is 250 pounds, he's 6'6", I'm 6'3", and he came in a black caftan looking like some sort of leader of a cult. And I'd read the book and I thought there's something weird about this book. And the book purported to be, he discovered 2 diaries of John Lennon that nobody had ever seen. And within these diaries, according to his book, were scurrilous stories about the relationship between Lennon and McCartney, stories that brought down these heroes of the 60s, these amazingly gifted musicians. You know, whatever you think of the Beatles and their political stances, I argue they were a force for good. John and Yoko's sleep-in brought massive attention to geopolitical things. And this man was taking, in vernacular English, we'd say taking a pop at the Beatles. But I read the book and I thought, well, it's interesting what to read. Anyway, this man came in, and there, we're in the studio, we're interviewing. And halfway through, suddenly I get this dawn of realization that this man's a liar. This man has made all this up. And suddenly I'm thinking, why am I so stupid? Why did I not see this before? This man is trying to sell a story to make money that is not true. And I suddenly thought, we were broadcasting live. I was broadcasting live. 7 million people listening. And I leant forward and I said, listen, before we go to the commercial break, no, it was after commercial break, forgive me, we just come back, because it was during the commercial break when you got 2 minutes to think. I said, welcome back, my guest today is Jeffrey, and his book is... And I said, Jeffrey, forgive me, this is a hard question to ask, but is any of this true?
Straightforward.
And he said, are you calling me a liar? And I said, well, I'm not using that word. I rephrased my question. Is any of this true? He said, you're calling me a liar. And he got up and he started to punch me. And I got up and I have done some training. I've been in some war zones. And I wrestled him to the floor and I held him in an arm lock. And this is all being broadcast. This is all going out on the air in the United Kingdom. And at the end, when he got out, I said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so sorry that this show is not as you would expect from Between the Lines, from me, your host, Paul Blézard, but can I strongly advise you never to read anything by this man or touch any of his books. He is a shameful curse upon the publishing industry, which works very, very hard to present stories that are factual, true, that if they are presented as factual and true. That was probably my worst interview.
Okay, that shows really
the importance actually of the media and honestly the honesty of the people who are doing this job, how much they have to be the truth without going with the line of something they don't believe in their heart. Once they believe or they realize that there is something wrong there. Shall we open the floor for a question? Any question here?
It's a question about your story you just told us about the diary of John Lennon, the author who wrote Jeffrey something, who wrote a book about diary of John Lennon. Well, John Lennon, you mentioned that there was scandal about Paul McCartney in this book. I think he's not afraid of lawsuit against him, because this is really, it's like offending.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to be honest, he should have been afraid of lawsuits, because the moment you publish a book, it is in the public domain. And if you're presenting something as truthful and fact, even in this age of post-truth, of fake news, when it's very difficult with social media spewing at us all the time to work out what is true and what is not, if something is in print, you would assume that it has been looked at by publishers, it's been looked over by lawyers and so on. This, as it turned out, this was self-published, dressed up to be something. The whole thing was rigged to make it look as if it had gone through the normal publishing process. In fact, I will name him. His name is Jeffrey Giuliano, and he was an American author who nobody has seen since. I have a feeling I killed any chance of him ever putting anything out in print again, and I'm happy with that.
Like you can write a fiction, but not
yes.
claiming to write about
Yes.
a diary of somebody who's really famous.
Right. My father once, he gave me a very good piece of advice, and I'm going to embarrass myself here. I used to tell lies when I was a child, and in my head they were just stories. And I would get into trouble for it because I'd say things that weren't true. Because I lived quite a boring childhood in many ways, and you want to make it more exciting, and also I was just a very bad, naughty little boy. And my father said, Paul, you have to realize, if you say something that isn't true with your mouth, that's a lie, and you'll be judged by that. But if you turn it into writing and present it as a work of imagination, that's a story. And the people that do that are called authors, and they write books. He said, you might want to consider that as a career path, because that's a way of getting these imaginative fictions that you have in your mind out there in a way that is acceptable and won't let people down. It was a good lesson to learn.
It's a great,
Also, I mean, something to learn, and also go as a path here. I mean,
Yes.
put your imagination at least all in paper, you know?
Absolutely. It's a good code for life. It's a good code for life. And I know Curtis was here. This is for the gentleman here. Curtis Jobling was here earlier on some days ago, and he and I have been having this long conversation about how difficult it is to get young boys to read. In the UK, I don't know if you have that problem here in the Emirates.
We have a lot of problem with the media and social.
Well, with social media and so on. Well, there's another problem, which is that boys, like sons, like daughters, will take their lead from their parents. And it's quite usual for daughters to see a mother reading a book. Mothers tend to do bedtime stories, in some households more than men. And one of the reasons that getting boys to read is harder is they very rarely see their fathers with a book. So if you want your sons to learn to read, show your sons that the fathers read. Fathers, carry a book, read a book, do the bedtime stories. Don't leave it to the mothers, don't leave it to the wives. Because if your sons see you with a book, you are their father, you are their hero. They will suddenly think, my dad reads a book, I will read a book. And suddenly it's all right, and then I know there are many other gender imbalances that we have to address, but that is the simplest way to get the generations beneath us to read. They mimic us. If we read, they read.
Thank you. The honor to be with the الملتقى literature salon, Mr. Paul, and it's one of honor for us. And actually, we wrote a book about ourselves long time, 2004. I call it Read by Force.
Read by force?
Because we forced ourselves 20 years ago to read, because we need to influence about our family and our children. And that's why our progress, we do it from 20 years. And now in 2016, we have a law for reading here. And also we have a month for reading. At least all our 20 years we saw, what we read by force is coming now by law. It's, I think,
yes.
To influence your family or your neighbors or your children. That's why you need, as you said, from the family, from the father or family, and that's why. My question to you, Mr. Paul, you meet a lot of people, more than 50,000. You said, who's affecting you, and who didn't forget you?
Who did I not forget? Who affected me?
Yeah. And you don't forget, because we did 2 years ago, we call it capsule literatures. We invite all our writers and our friends, and we make round tables, and we call it capsule literature. In 3 minutes, which book influenced you?
Which book?
And influence in you, in everyone. And
Good.
we get around 100 book now. Okay. We make a book about it, who is influenced in all this 120 people is in the round table. And ask you, you met somebody, it's still, you need to interview him again?
Which person or which book? Do you want me to do which
Could
book?
be both. The person and book.
Both?
Could be both, yes.
Okay.
Would be interesting to know.
Well, first, can I congratulate you on the initiative that you started 21 years ago that is now turning into law here. That means you are an influencer. You were a disruptor 21 years ago. And congratulations to all of you in that book group. That's an extraordinary story. And keep going. Find the next boundaries. Because, of course, the sum of human knowledge, everything that our forefathers that have learned from their forefathers, that we've learned from our forefathers, is contained in these books. The stories, the facts, the science, the medicine, the history, the politics. These books are the record of our existence on this planet, this endangered planet. So they're massively important. So well done. Which person, these are very difficult questions. Which person has affected me most?
Yeah.
I mean, I could go easily, you know, you cannot not meet the Dalai Lama and not be affected. When you know the story, when I've got goosebumps. When he first takes your hand and he holds your hand and he won't let go until he's finished talking to you. And then you get the white silk scarf. There's something curiously humbly human, humble human, small, but at the same time completely superhuman about him at the same time. He's an extraordinary man. There is spirit, and he is the embodiment of spirit, and so yes. However, okay, I'll do it in the last 5 days. Can I answer it in the last 5 days?
Yeah.
Who knows the name Malala Yousafzai?
Yes, we know him.
You know Malala?
About his daughter, his book about that story.
Have you met her father?
Yeah, here no, we don't have chance because it's...
Okay. 3 days ago, I was in conversation at the stage there with Ziauddin Yousafzai, who is a man who was brought up in the northern part of the Swat Valley in Pakistan, in a very traditional society where they spoke Pashtun and a branch of Pashtun, where the generational gender tradition was that in the house, men did nothing. The women made the tea, Pakistani tea. You heat the milk, you get the leaves, you stir, you put the sugar, you heat, you ladle. Where women prepare the food, they cut the chicken, they kill the chicken, they pluck the chicken, they cook the chicken. They then feed to the men the best bits, the legs and the breasts of the chicken. The women eat in another room, in a family house. And this is a man who, when he had a daughter, he was brought up by 3 mothers. Long story, not going to do it now. But he at 16 thought, this is not fair. My phrase for it is different from his. My phrase is, well, it's an old phrase, but women hold up half the sky. So he started to help in the house. He would do the ironing. He'd help with the cleaning. 16-year-old Pakistani boy, multi-generational, of men who do nothing. So he was already a disruptor. So then he became a school teacher. He wanted to be a doctor, became a school teacher, and he decided that he wanted girls to be educated as much as boys. And he went against centuries of tradition and said, to this school, there will be girls. There will be girls, there will be boys. The girls will wear the same uniform as the boys. They will have the same lessons as the boys, because these girls can be doctors, can be engineers, can be poets, can be philosophers, can be politicians, as much as anyone. And this is before Benazir Bhutto. So he was already a disruptor. And then the Taliban came. And he set himself up in this village against the Taliban. He said, no, this is a school for girls as well as boys. And he knew he was a target. And I was asking him on stage, I said, how does that conversation run between you and your wife, who is your biggest partner, your biggest supporter, who holds up half your sky, when you are putting your family in danger? And he said, well, my wife told me one night, he said, if we believe in this, we have to do it. If it means we die, we have died for something we believe in. There is no greater way to live. And then some weeks later, Malala was shot because she was on the bus promoting the right for girls to be educated in the Swat Valley of northern Pakistan under the Taliban. So here's how that's the story. For those of you who don't know it, I'm sure you know most of it, do buy his book. So Ziauddin Yousafzai has affected me with one phrase, and sometimes it needs a bit of thinking about because it sounds more simple than it actually is. He said, it used to be that Malala Yousafzai was my daughter. Now I, Ziauddin Yousafzai, am her father.
Wow.
And doesn't that change everything? And for that, that man has affected me greatly. And every time we bump into each other, it's a big hug. And I will remember meeting him and the message that he imparts until the day I die. And that was here in this fair.
Yeah,
Does that answer your question?
yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, it's very long, but...
No, thank you.
The questions brings actually itself. What do you think? I mean, you've been interviewing a lot of people. You had programs with over 1,700 programs. What the meeting interviewed you had with a woman already that really, I mean, was different. At the same time, what would you had? I mean, did you had with all the programs you did more to the gender targeted?
I have always made it very, very clear that for every man, I interview a woman. For every woman, I interview a man. Because there are as many fantastic books written by women as there are by men. And the great thing about publishing is there always have been, in my lifetime. We are way past the 100 years ago when women had to publish under a man's name. So, you think of the women of the 17th and 18th, 19th centuries in Britain who published under a man's name, everybody from George Eliot to, well, yes, you know them all. So, I mean, the great joy is I was brought up by women. I was brought up, my father is my stepfather, my mother was a single-parent mother for some time after a tragedy. I come from a French family of a very strong mother, a very strong grandmother, and I was brought up in a very small village until I was 12 in France, where, in fact, the title in our family comes through the female line. I have this silly French title, which I never use. So I have always... Okay, here's another thing. Ziauddin Yousafzai, Malala's dad, do you know the thing he misses now that Malala is at university? Have a guess. He obviously misses her smile, he misses her voice, yeah? The thing he misses most is the thing he used to love doing when she was going to school. He would iron her shalwar kameez. So, and I'm a man who irons, so all that stuff. So talking to people like Margaret Atwood, talking to people like Margaret Thatcher is as important as I've realized, I've talked about Bill Clinton, the Dalai Lama, all men. I'm a man. We're blind to our own blindness in a way. So yes, I've been very fortunate to spend time with some extraordinary women, of whom I have to say I recently did a very small interview with Michelle Obama. And I have to say, in her, I see great hope for the future.
So probably she come back.
Well, I don't know.
Election?
It was for an Oxford college. No, I don't know. I don't know that she will run for office. Okay. I don't know. After the brutal treatment that Hillary got in the last election, who would do that? There was a question, I think, over here. Forgive me, I have to go in 3 minutes because I have to be on stage there at 2 o'clock. But
okay.
We have 5 minutes.
Pleasure to have you in Multaqā, Mr. Paul.
It is my honor.
The title this year for our salon is The Third Culture. And
the third culture.
Yes, and having traveled all around the world, meeting so many personalities, I would like if you can give us a word of advice how to embrace life from what you saw all around. If you want to conclude this huge experience in life,
what have I learned?
Give us an advice where we can embrace the world in order to be citizens of the world, because the third culture requests from us to embrace things the way it is in its actual presence. And I'm honored to have you in Al-Multaqā.
The honor and the privilege is entirely mine. It's a very good question. I hope I have understood it correctly. This has nothing to do with books until it has something to do with books. In 1993, 94, 95, I lived in Rwanda. You know about Rwanda. I was there before. I lived in Kigali before, during, after the genocide. I was writing some poetry, but I was there as a businessman and I was doing stuff for the United Nations. So I saw the horror, the worst horror this world has seen since the Second World War. And in the midst of that horror, you see flickers of humanity. You see a child come out of their home, a mud hut home, with brilliant white socks, an incredibly clean white shirt, and they are going to school. for the most appalling situation, they are going to school. So I just want to posit that illustration in your minds. So at a time when 800,000 people are being murdered, when everybody's frightened of everybody else, here's what the third culture is. And it's back to, I'm sorry, it's back to what we started, those 2 lessons of interviewing. Because the 2 lessons
the
of
3
interviewing
lesson, I think,
are the lessons of what you learn. Wherever you are in the world, look somebody in the eye, say hello, shake their hand, put your hand over your heart or whatever. Because we are all human beings, and it doesn't matter if you are white or Arabic or black or Asian or Bangladeshi or Australian or Aboriginal or green with purple spots. We are all the same species, Homo sapiens. And however different we look, however different we sound, however different our modes of life are, or the shape of our houses, or the size of our cars, or the smallness of our donkeys, we're all human beings. Just make contact. I am probably going to be very angry, make some people angry here now, so forgive me. I have been very honored to be allowed to come to the United Arab Emirates for the last 10, 12 years. And I have made some lovely friends who are British and Swedish and French and German who have lived in the Arab Emirates, United Arab Emirates, for 20 years, but who do not speak a word of Arabic. And I do not understand that. If you are going to live in a country for more than 6 months, learn some basic phrases in that language, just as a matter of respect. Because if you cannot speak to the people with whom you live, how can you possibly understand their culture? And until you can understand their culture, how can you have the right to expect them to understand yours? And humanity is a two-way thing. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
شكراً.
Thank you. في أي أسئلة أخرى? No? Mr. Paul, it's our great honor to have you here. We would like to have more time to
You're very kind.
But by the way, you didn't tell me my grading. Did you have a grading for the interview? Did you thought about the grading of the interview?
10 out of 10, of course. Please, would you give huge round of applause to this wonderful interviewer who I have great hope for.
Thank you very
so
much.
And
Don't
thank
worry.
you so much for having me.
We're really great honor to have you here.
You've been very
Thank
kind. It's
you.
been my privilege.
Thank you very much. Thank you.